it will, after the webinar, will be on our YouTube channel and also in the film archive of WebEx. Today's the first day that we're going to be doing videos in the webinar, so bear with us if there's any bandwidth problems. Things should go smoothly though. Without further ado, I turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it, and thank you everyone for joining me here on this webinar series. I should start by saying this is my first webinar, so you know, if I mess up, please overlook that. And so I'm here to talk about ethnography and film, and I want to talk a little bit about the topics I'll be covered within this webinar. I'm going to be looking specifically at, or I'm going to be talking specifically at, not all the ways in which one can incorporate filmmaking into research, but some of the ways in which I have incorporated filmmaking into my own research, and sort of explore the different ways to do that. I'm going to focus sort of also on the practicality of making a film, how to develop a proposal, shoot, edit an ethnographic film, and how to distribute and promote ethnographic film. Some of the experiences, some of the things that I've learned being the co-director for Society for Visual Anthropology Film Festival and being on the jury. What are the do's and don'ts for a film festival? We'll touch up a little bit on the ethical concerns and issues of representation as it's relevant to ethnographic film, but we probably won't spend too much time on it because there's already a lot of material written on this topic out there, and I feel like I don't have too much to add to what's already out there. I also want to think about the audience for ethnographic film, which is constantly shifting and changing, and how do you keep your films relevant and be seen by different people within this new landscape of new media and social media, and what does that look like? I know that a lot of people are interested in hearing about ethnographic film as an academic publication. What are the ways in which you can sort of claim, or you can do scholarly work through ethnographic film, or at least you can get people to recognize ethnographic film as a form of scholarly publication. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about my experience of teaching ethnographic filmmaking at Towson University, and I think hopefully this whole webinar will somehow give us a little bit of context on what film can offer to anthropology, which I think is the contribution to film is immense. There's a lot that folks should be excited about, and there's a lot of opportunities there. So let's get started. I should start with a disclaimer that even though it's incredibly gracious for American Anthropology Association to invite me to conduct this webinar, I'm not in any way an expert on ethnographic film. For me, the process of ethnographic film making is constantly evolving. It's a creative process that's constantly changing. And I approach my film work as well as my research with a sort of a sense of experimentation and learning. I feel like I learn every time I work on a new project. I learn something new, and I try to fold that into my future projects. So I also encourage you to take that similar approach to ethnographic film. For a lot of folks who are hearing this webinar or watching this webinar, this probably is their first time maybe making an ethnographic film. And I just want to say that, don't be afraid to make mistakes and have false starts. And you are allowed to change your mind. And that is part of the process of being a filmmaker as well as a visual anthropologist, in my opinion. So with that out of the way, I'll just give you a little bit of background of my training was at San Francisco State University in visual anthropology under the direction of Peter Biela, who's a visual anthropologist. He taught me ethnographic filmmaking. I did my PhD, as Andrew mentioned, at American University. And my advisor was David Vine, who really taught me how to write effective ethnography. And I think there is a very strong relationship between being able to write well as being able to tell a good story and being able to make a good film that is effective and that communicates with the audience. So I just want to emphasize that. And currently I'm teaching at Towson University, where I teach visual anthropology, anthropology media, anthropology of gender, and South Asian popular culture and cinema. I've been making films for over 10 years now, mostly short films. I don't think I've ever made, I've worked on one feature-length project, but I've made mostly short films because I find the short medium a much more effective medium in the classroom and as a pedagogical tool. And I think, I can effectively tell a story within a very short period of time. And that's always been kind of a challenge that I give myself, and I find it to be a very useful medium. So I've made a number of films as an undergrad, and then I've made a few films as a graduate student at American University. I've used various styles in my approach to ethnographic film, everything from kind of more conceptual work to experimental work to sort of made-for-television documentary, such as Roots of Love, and my forthcoming film, Mardistan Manland, which is actually going to be released this summer, and a film that I'm currently in the process of developing, Sent Away Boys. The kind of topics that I'm really interested in looking at are the topics, that are also part of my dissertation, but I'm really interested in looking at gender, migration. I'm interested in looking at sort of the intersection of race, religion, ethnicity, and how to communicate that in a kind of a visual way. And so a lot of my films have been around that topic. Roots of Love is about the rites of passage that young men go through, Sikh young men go through, which is the turban tying ceremony and the decision to cut their hair and what that means for the community. Mardisan's about masculinity and different reflections on masculinity in North India, and Sent Away Boys is actually about migration and young men who leave Punjab, which is the region where I do my research, and what does it mean for a community where a lot of the young men who are either left or sent away by their families to seek a better future or more opportunities elsewhere. I've also used short video format as a kind of way of doing videos that are addressing a specific issue. There's a video when the human terrain system, were announced, and there were a lot of folks who were concerned about the kind of participation anthropologists were doing in the war in Iraq in 2007. I used the video format to make a quick video, which ended up becoming, and I put it on YouTube, and ended up becoming a pretty useful tool in which David Vine talks about the kind of ethical concerns around the human terrain system. So in that sense, my films, I'd like to think that my films are more about kind of more of a deeper meditation on the topics I'm interested in looking at, and the video is kind of a very immediate response to a specific issue or topic. I want to quickly show a clip from my forthcoming film, Mardistan, and I'll talk about this film in the process of working through this presentation. And I'm going to also show you a trailer from my previous film, Roots of Love. So let's just get these out of the way, and then we'll talk about the rest of the material here. So.
While growing up, I realized there was a certain kind of men I would not like to be. I would not like to become an uncle of my own people. I would not like to become a leader of my own. I would not like to pull a gun on somebody because I had a gun. ਸਾਡੇ ਸਮਾਜ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਲੜਕਾ ਤੇ ਲੜਕੀ ਦਾ ਫਰਕ ਹੈ ਨਾ ਇਹ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਚੱਲਦਾ ਆਇਆ ਪੁਰਾਣੇ ਜ਼ਮਾਨੇ 'ਚ ਕੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਬੇਟੀ ਹੋਈ ਹੈ ਉਦੋਂ ਹੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਬੜਾ ਕੁੱਤੇ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਪੈਦਾ ਹੋਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਕੁੱਤੀ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਸੋਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਦਲੀ ਸਿਰਫ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਬਦਲ ਗਏ ਜਦੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਚੱਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਕੁੱਤੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋਇਆ ਉਦੋਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਲਾਈਫ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਮੈਂ ਤੇ ਆਉਂ ਹੀ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਯਾਰ ਇਹ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ and we learn that there are certain laws learning to become a woman is good.
A little bit of a sense of my work and my films, and I also want to talk about that sequence later on in this webinar. So I just wanted to share that with you. I should also just say that if people have a specific, sort of topic that they'd like for me to elaborate on, feel free to send that question in the chat window, and I'm happy to talk about something more in detail as I'm going through this. So thinking about incorporating filmmaking into ethnographic research, I think there's many ways that one can approach this. And sort of the two major ways that I see in which film can be incorporated into ethnographic research is the idea of using film as a form of data, and the idea of using film as a form of as a representation of that data. And there is a growing field within anthropology of visual research analysis that uses film as a form of data, which where folks actually spend time analyzing a film as a kind of a text, as a sort of a textual, document. And in fact, there is a book by Jonathan, whose name I'm now forgetting, Jonathan Marion and Jerome Crowder on visual research, which speaks to this. There's also, my approach to ethnographic film is more using film as a form of a sensorial experience, and the idea of doing sensory ethnography. Sarah Pink writes about this, and some of the filmmakers who've done similar films, and examples of that can be seen in Robert Gardner's work, Lucian Taylor and Ilse Barbash's work, The Sweetgrass, and the documentary titled Forest of Bliss, which do that. That gives you a sense. The sensorial ethnography is about giving you a sense of a place and a space through the use of film and media. A film can also be a form of collaborative form of knowledge production, and I think we can look towards Sarah Elder's work, who works quite a bit on producing collaborative knowledge, working with communities that they research, anthropologists research, to produce a film as a collaborative document, as a collaborative representation of that specific community. For me, film very much is about creating a form of intimate engagement, and that allows the people who are viewing the film in a sort of an intimate experience into the world that I'm trying to understand and represent. And I recently actually watched a film called Screening Room, which was programmed at last year's SVA Film Festival, and it's a good example of that because it's a film that is about, it's sort of set in a screening room from morning to evening, and it gives you a sense of what are the different processes that take place in a hospital waiting room. Actually, I'm sorry, that's the title of the film. Also, film can be a form of public anthropology, and to engage people into a dialogue and social change. And I think it can be used in sort of a very immediate way to create conversations around specific topics, such as the human brain system, which one topic around which we used YouTube video as a way of creating a conversation. A film as a form of representation, an ethnographic document, is also, I also think about it in a way in which it also allows my participants to sort of speak in their own voices and speak on their own terms, and talk about some of their experiences in their own voices. And I think that's also a very productive and important way in which we can think about incorporating film into anthropology. I think one of the sort of ways in which I approach film, and perhaps one of the ways in which I'm sort of not interested in thinking about ethnographic film, is the kind of debate that has taken place especially in the 80s and the 90s on how do you define ethnographic film. And I think this is a question that a lot of my students ask me a lot about how to define ethnographic film. And I'm never quite sure if there is one definition of ethnographic film. There's wonderful conversations that has taken place. In fact, the visualizing theory, this compilation by Lucy and Taylor, there's a lot of essays in here that has conversations around the definition of ethnographic film. But I think, you know, I think it's sort of useful to recognize different ways in which we can incorporate film into ethnography. And for me, what works is the form of intimate engagement that film can provide, the kind of dialogue that film can provide, which to me might not be as easily, it cannot happen as easily with textual ethnography. So I think one of the first things when you're getting ready to make a film or thinking about incorporating a film into your ethnographic research is to ask, what is the intended outcome for your project? What is it that you're trying to do with the use of film that might not be possible through written ethnography or other forms of conventional mediums of research and representation? What can film add to the work that you do? You know, I think that's a question that I often ask, especially given that it actually requires quite a bit of time to produce and distribute a film. You know, I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. I threw in some films in here that I use in my classroom, which to me I think are very effective models of ethnography and documentary film, and they're not all done by anthropologists, but you know, I just wanted to share some of those with you. I think these are good these are good models to look at when you're thinking about how you want to approach a film and what kind of film that you want to make within your research. Particularly the work of Trinh Minh Ha has been particularly inspiring to my work. Marlon Raig's Tongues Untied was one of the first documentaries that really made me want to be an ethnographic filmmaker, or made me want to be a filmmaker, because the sort of level of honesty and the way in which he approaches his work is just amazing. And then also, I wanted to just point out a couple of films on this slide. My Mother India, which is a documentary by Safina Broy, is also a very powerful film in my opinion, because it uses family biography and biography as a way of telling a story of a community, and I think that's also a powerful form of storytelling within ethnographic film, and I've used that within my work as well. And I guess you can sort of say that as a kind of a form of autoethnography. I've also used, when I'm on my last few films that I've been working on, Roots of Love specifically, which is a film that I knew was going to play on television. I had received funding. I also used some models from This American Life, which is a TV show, as a model for the kind of visual style that I incorporated into my documentary. And I think that worked out really well, because it gave me a sense of, you know, my audience being the television audience, and what is an effective sort of approach to documentary, especially when you're thinking about broadcast television. And I think I just mentioned the documentary Waiting Room, which is a very powerful documentary. So thinking about ethnographic film within my research, for me, the filmmaking process is very similar to the process of writing, and it usually happens. I start making films usually after I've actually done the research, and often I've actually written about the communities that I study. And also, I also think that ethnographic film or filmmaking is a form of an active writing, because there is a process of interpretation that is simultaneously going on, and you're trying to figure out you're trying to capture this text, this visual material that you're going to use, but at the same time you're trying to make sense of it. And even though in the editing room you get to cut the film together and put it together, there's not a lot of opportunity to go back and ask certain questions the way you can do when you're writing an ethnography. So it requires one to be, when I'm filming, it requires one to be very, very aware of what is being said and what the kind of conversations that are happening. In thinking about film compared to a book-length ethnography, I think a feature-length film, the way in which I have approached film compared to written ethnographies is, I don't think a feature-length film can do what a book-length ethnography can do in terms of providing a portrait of a specific community, a very broad portrait of a specific community, or trying to understand a specific issue or a specific culture. What it can do and it can do very effectively, is give people a small experience of one slice of that of a particular culture that is being studied. It can show 1 inch of the larger picture, which a book-length ethnography can provide through lots of context and discussion and theoretical framings. Because of the medium of film and the restrictions that imposes, it cannot necessarily. I don't think it's very effective if the intention for the film is to give a very broad understanding of a specific community. I think more effective use of film is to give people a very specific input or an experience into the communities that we study and represent. So there are different levels of engagement, and I think with film, and I think it's really good to keep in mind the strengths and weaknesses of film as a medium of communication as you incorporate it into your work, and what it can and cannot do. And I think that for me, film does not necessarily replace text-based ethnography or written ethnographic writing, but it can add to or complement other forms of knowledge production. So it can be complementary to the mediums of knowledge production, and it can provide a sort of a level of intimate engagement that is maybe not possible when writing about a specific topic or issue. For instance, I think being able to see that experience of a young man undergoing the turban tying ceremony in the presence of his family, or a young man undergoing the hair cutting in the presence of his friends, is much, much more effective than, and I can show it and get my students to engage with it on a much more personal level and on a more intimate level than I can ever do by writing about it. And I think some people who are amazing writers can do that very effectively, but for me, the medium film becomes that medium where I can have that intimate level engagement. And I think I always think, as I'm making films, how my undergraduate students who are starting, often I teach a class on cultural anthropology, intro to cultural anthropology, and I always sort of think of them as my audience for the films that I make, because I really want them to engage with this material. Excuse me. And I think one of the things that I've seen repeatedly, time and time again, is one of the things you can do very effectively with film is to teach students how to view something with empathy, and to be able to, which you cannot teach empathy using a textbook, but through the use of film, my students are able to understand and enter into the world of my participants or the world I study, and are able to see that there are these underlying similarities as well as differences, and are able to engage with it on an intimate level. And I think that for that, film is an incredibly effective tool in teaching students empathy and how to empathize with people who are not them or their peers. So in that sense, my process to ethnographic film, I often do my research on a topic that I'm interested in studying. I often spend a lot of time doing sort of conventional ethnographic research before I even get to, before I even think about picking up my camera and making a documentary or making a film. You know, to give you an example, the 3 documentaries, Roots of Love, Mardistan, and the forthcoming project Sent Away Boys, actually is based on, or it comes from, or it follows rather, a 200-page dissertation that I wrote on the topic of migration, gender, masculinity in North India. And so I almost think of the films as kind of a chapters in my dissertation, you know, very sort of descriptive and illustrative chapters in my dissertation. And I think, like I said before, you know, what dissertation can do, or what a textbook length ethnography can do, is really sort of talk very broadly about a specific community or topic. But what film can do is bring you right into that community. And I think both of those sort of forms of knowledge production are important and are complementary. So one of the things that I always tell my students is, rather than trying to, you know, understand something very, very broad, or something, try to understand a big cultural phenomenon, I encourage them to figure out what's one part of their story, one part of the community that they want to study. What is that they can represent about that community? And I think that allows you, so by thinking of film as a form of ethnographic vignette, but not necessarily a comprehensive understanding of a specific culture, keeps you from sort of biting off too much, or biting off more than sort of you can chew. And I think it also allows you to kind of approach it more realistically about, in terms of the time and effort that it requires, and what are the limitations of the medium of film as a medium of communication. I always tell my students, and when I'm often making my film, is I always ask this question: what's at stake for the people whose lives I'm representing? And I think that's a very good question to ask, because oftentimes I start thinking about a project, but I usually, sort of, I lose interest, or I not lose interest, but I sort of feel like it's not something that I'm willing to commit or to work on for the next 12 months or so. So I think it's really important to understand that sense of commitment before you take on a film project, because it does require a lot of work, and to really ask what is at stake. And in fact, there's a chapter that is coming out in Anthropology Now, where I talk about how all the films that I've worked on so far have been sort of inspired by kind of, or have followed sort of moments of loss and trauma, and inspired by moments that I was trying to make sense of, not just within my work, but also in kind of a personal life. And I think that gave me the reason to keep working at it, and keep keeping with it to be able to tell that story to its end. So let me talk a little bit about getting started and talk a little bit about proposals and funding. I think, as I'm doing research, and when I was doing research for my my dissertation, I kept a lot of note cards where I would write down different ideas that I had for documentary films, like different aspects of my research that I can possibly create into these visual narratives through the use of ethnographic film. And what that did was it allowed me to sort of pull out some of the things that I was interested in looking at and didn't end up getting lost within my field notes, where the tendency is to record and write down everything that you see and observe. And instead, when I was thinking about, the material that I wrote down on my note cards were, things that I thought that could be stories that I could tell more effectively using the visual medium. And then I used different grant opportunities usually for small grants like $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and to create funding proposals and writing a treatment. I think even though writing a treatment is something that I'm sorry, there's a chopper going by. I hope this is not too disruptive. Even though you can approach writing a proposal similar to writing a dissertation proposal. Writing a film proposal is not very different from writing a dissertation proposal. And oftentimes when you're writing a proposal, one of the things that people will ask you is for a treatment. And there's a lot of resources online where it talks about how to write an effective documentary treatment. And that can be a little bit of a challenge, because especially if you don't really know, what your film is going to be about, you haven't started filming yet, you don't have a sense of what your treatment is going to be, or what your film is going to look like. And what a treatment is a sort of a scene-by-scene description of what your final film is going to be like. And I think oftentimes that can be challenging, especially if you haven't started filming and you haven't collected your material. So I often turn to my research to inform my treatment. I write a very I write a treatment with the awareness that is probably going to change later on. And I think you can also think about so within the proposal you have your synopsis, which is similar to an abstract. It needs to communicate. Submitting an abstract to a conference or a book proposal. A treatment is your story and visual style in which that you're going to use to tell a specific story that you're proposing. And a distribution plan. I think oftentimes what I see is that filmmakers don't really spend a lot of time thinking about distribution and what's going to happen with their films, what's going to happen once it's made, where it's going to be played. And a lot of places where there's a lot of funding organizations who are looking to fund documentary films or ethnographic films, they want to see that you have a very clear sense of what you're going to do with your film afterwards. And we'll talk a little bit more about distribution after I'm done talking about production and post-production. But I think it is really important to think about having a distribution plan from the very beginning. And I think that gives you a sense of what that also gives you a sense of what the style and form of your film is going to be like. Putting together a budget, keeping in mind how you can keep costs low. Crowdfunding has become a very popular venue for a lot of starting filmmakers to raise money for their projects. I think it's a great way to raise, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, which is usually, most of my films are under $10,000. They're never made for more than that. A lot of the money actually goes toward the cost of the plane ticket flying to and from India, you know, and I'm able to usually secure a lot of the equipment through my university, and I'm able to, you know, get the editing resources donated from my university. And I'm sure a lot of people, you know, who are in academia are also able to do that. So I think it's always good to keep costs low, but at the same time anticipate, you know, non-equipment related expenses, because ultimately, you know, you do end up putting out a lot of money, you know, oftentimes on your own credit card when you're working on a film project, and it is more costly, surprisingly more costly to make a film than to just do ethnographic research. So also, I think one of the things that I wanted to ask is, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to ask this earlier, do people have specific models that they have used for inspiration in working on their own projects? Does anybody want to share maybe you know, maybe you can somebody can talk about you know, what they've used in the past as models for inspiration for their proposals. Does anybody want to share that? Okay, I guess we'll move on, and maybe somebody will type in a response there. As I said, there's an article in Anthropology Now where I talk about this in more detail in the forthcoming issue. And for me, one of the most important aspect of making, you know, telling an effective story and making a film is the act of doing pre-interviews. I think, you know, I don't even touch the camera until I've done pre-interviews with my participants, and oftentimes I just use you know, an audio recorder just for the purpose of recording the interviews, and it's a very small audio recorder, and we just have a very broad conversation about the topic that I'm interested in exploring. And then I transcribe those pre-interviews, and I think it's really effective mode because you know, it allows people to kind of, participants to talk about their experiences very openly without the intimidation of having a camera right there next to you. And one of the things that I've also found over the years making films is that oftentimes when you turn on the camera, you know, people respond or perform in very different ways than, let's say, if they're just having a conversation with you. So I think, you know, in the article, I give an example of young men talking about sexual violence, and you know, when I was making the documentary on how the kind of conversations that took place off camera were very different from the kind of conversations that took place on camera, and I deliberately didn't include you know, certain parts of those conversations on camera because I knew that they were at times lying, or they were not sort of saying what they had said off camera because out of the worry that they will be misrepresented on screen. And I think so doing pre-interviews is actually really important to my process. And what I usually do is I take an audio recorder, I record the interviews, I transcribe them. It also gives you an opportunity to scout out locations and try to get the visual details and logistics. I usually take a still camera and take lots of pictures of, you know, my participants' home or where they hang out. And it gives you an opportunity to assess, you know, how's the lighting in that room, or if I'm going to need, you know, to bring in certain equipment, you need to bring in an extra light. You know, if there's a lot of noise, I think that's a very effective time to do that. And after I'm done transcribing the material, and after I have a very clear sense of, I've scouted out the location, I've have a very clear sense of, sorry, I'm just going to pause and let this chopper pass by. I didn't realize until now how noisy my apartment is. And this is a really good example of location scouting and something that you have to keep in mind when you're out thinking about where you're going to shoot your materials. So after I've finished sort of scouting the location and doing the pre-interviews and transcribe them, I often rewrite my treatment, and I make my students rewrite their treatments as well after they're done doing that, based on the new information. And I think what that does is that I can pull out, by doing that, I can pull out some key themes that I want to focus on, as opposed to just turning on the camera and letting people speak for hours, which ends up producing a lot of footage that then you have to later sift through. I also, take transcripts of interviews with me as a form of elicitation device when I'm shooting, because, folks, sometimes they get very nervous talking in front of a camera, or they forget what they had said. So oftentimes I'll read their response off of my transcript to say, oh, you mentioned this, and can you tell me this story about the first time you cut your hair? Can you tell this specific story? And it's a good way of sort of directing the conversation to where you want it to go, and getting them to talk about the material that you're interested in capturing. I just want to quickly talk about pre-production, which oftentimes is a sort of a process leading up to the production. Oftentimes, the more pre-production that you can do when you're out making a film, the more easy your production is going to be. And the trick with pre-production is to anticipate each and every sort of problem that might arise, and anticipate all the different factors, all the different roles, all the different ways in which you can control, sort of factor in and control your environment, to make sure that when you actually go out with your camera and shoot, that you're not going to run into any problems. I often use a camera. Mardasan was shot with a camcorder that cost $600. I think last time I checked, it's actually $400. It's an HD camcorder. So they're amazingly small, light camcorders and tripods that you can use now to get fantastic footage and fantastic material. I often use a separate audio recorder, and with a lavalier and a boom mic. There's a recorder that made by Zoom, which is a really good one. So so that's a good one to use. And for those of you who haven't used Final Cut Pro, or who haven't used any of the editing software, there are a lot of plugins that come now where you can automatically sync the audio that has been recorded separate from the video that is recorded on camera. It will automatically sync it. So there's a voice recognition, there's a sound recognition software that will sync it. A plugin is called Plural Eyes, but Final Cut Pro is, so what that allows you to do is to keep the sound separate, and if anything goes wrong with your with your footage, or if there, you can at least use the sound bite as a form of to juxtapose with some cutaways, and also it also allows you to control the audio recording a little bit more. I just want to talk a little bit about, usually when I'm working on a film project, I have a cinematographer who is in charge of the camera. I have an assistant director who anticipates everything that is not sort of interview related. He'll figure out, the production schedules. He'll figure out, where to get the lunch from. He'll figure out, making sure everybody signs the releases. So he gets all the details. And I think it's really helpful to have to work with someone, to collaborate with someone who can provide you with that kind of support, because when you're actually trying to focus on, I mean, when you're doing interviews, it's especially for film, you really have to focus in on the person who's in front of you, and you know, as a director, you cannot really be distracted by sort of the other details, often mundane details around you know, lighting or you know, or power, or where to get the power from. Especially in a place like India, where there are so many things that can go wrong. You know, oftentimes I shoot in the summertime. There's usually monsoon. You have to deal with monsoons, light cuts, no electricity, and sort of travel-related nightmares. So you know, I think it's good to keep in mind Murphy's Law, you know, and sort of anticipate anything that can go wrong, will probably go wrong, and try to mitigate, you know, any upcoming or forthcoming disasters. So also having a shot list is helpful. I don't storyboard my when I'm going out to shoot, but shot list is actually incredibly helpful. And one of the things that I try to make a shot list of is not just the interview that I'm going to shoot, but also what are the kind of visual details that I'm going to collect at a specific site or at a specific place that gives you a sense of that place. And oftentimes it's really easy to forget that you need to get those cutaways, or you need to get that material. And having a shot list allows you to look down and say, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that, and be able to sort of make sure that you get good cutaways. You know, I think when you're in production, it is an incredibly stressful. It is an incredibly stressful experience because you're dealing with all these details. You're trying to work with a lot of people with different personalities. Yeah, at the same time, it can be incredibly exciting as well. So it's good to have a very short and succinct production schedule. And what ends up happening is that oftentimes you sort of, when I'm working with, so filmmaking, unlike, you know, doing ethnographic research, is much more kind of is a much more collaborative process. I think Andrew's telling me to. Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of these slides because I think Andrew wants me to sort of wrap up. But I think if you get a chance to look over this, there's some information about post-production workflow and production details, which I won't get into here because of lack of time. And I do want to talk about distribution and publicity. There are different venues to share and share your film and publicize your film. You know, I've listed a few here, but one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is that these venues are constantly changing. There are, you know, sort of documentary distributors, but also I've often put my films on YouTube and Vimeo. I've negotiated contracts with distribution companies where they can sell my DVD for a particular film for a particular cost, but also I can also then put the film online for people to be able to use and make it open source. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, you know, what's important for you. And I think if there's not really a point in making a film if no one's really going to see it. So I think committing to 6 to 12 months promoting and screening of your film is incredibly important. I really recommend developing a distribution strategy around film festivals that you're going to submit to in academic conferences and community screenings, and having a publicity plan using social media, press kit, having a press kit and a trailer. You know, one of the things that I, as a film festival jury member and as a film festival director, and something that I've learned as a filmmaker as well, is is the one of the insights that I've learned is that you never want to submit your work in progress. Don't ever submit your work in progress. Instead, take the time to finish your film before you actually go on to submit it to a film festival, because most film festivals, oftentimes they'll send the films out to be reviewed by other people, and they're not necessarily seeing it, or they're not realizing that this is just a work in progress, or they're not necessarily seeing it as work in progress. So you really want to actually, I think it's a kind of a waste of money if you do submit works in progress. You really want to get your film at least 90% there before you actually go out to submit it to a particular film festival, because most film reviewers are watching hundreds of films, and it's really easy to overlook something that is not completely finished. So I would recommend people ask film festivals for fee waivers, and you can read through the rest of the material here. The one thing I want to talk about quickly, and I know that this is something that folks brought up and they wanted me to touch up on, is how scholarly research is used within tenure and promotion criteria. So the ways in which it has worked for me is that Towson University, I have other faculty members who have already negotiated how my films will be recognized, and each film counts as a major publication, and each time it's shown at an academic conference, it's considered a reprint. And I really recommend that before people sort of negotiate their tenure requirements, they really check out the SBA AAA guidelines for evaluating ethnographic media, and use that as a guide to get the administration to recognize ethnographic film as a legitimate form of scholarship. One of the challenges with that is that not all films are, being on SBA Film Festival, I can say that not a lot of the films, even though we get 200 films, and we're able to we get over 200 hours of programming, and we're able to show only 25 films. And I think somebody asked, well, if you submit your film to SBA Film Festival, is that a form of peer review? Even though it's being reviewed by other anthropologists, acceptance into the SBA, people shouldn't use the acceptance into SBA Film Festival as a kind of as a form of peer review, because we are not able to accept each and every film because of the lack of time and restrictions that we have. So instead, what I recommend is, so we can only program a very short period of time in terms of films. Instead, what I recommend is that people, submit their films to academic conferences. Conferences certainly, showing films at conferences can certainly be used as a criteria for sort of academic or scholarly recognition. Also, getting journals to write reviews of your films is incredibly important to be able to show. I've often used I have a lot of my colleagues who've used my film within their classroom, and I've shown that as a form of doing ethnographic scholarly research, and sort of making the argument that my film is a form of scholarly research. I've also created multiple versions of my film, one for film festival, one for classroom, and a director's cut. So I think thinking creatively around the way in which folks can distribute their films and promote their films is incredibly important. And you really do, unfortunately, you really do have to make an argument within within your own discipline or within your own institution for it to be recognized as a form of ethnographic film. I think Andrew's asking me to wrap up, so I want to give opportunity for some people to ask some questions if they have any.
Yeah, sorry about that. I guess, appropriately, this film will be available online, and some of you were asking about the PDF. That will also be available. But I think I would like to get to just a few questions. Namely, one of the ones that seemed to be coming up a lot was about objectivity and biases that are created within the film, and how you as a producer can, I guess, limit the amount of bias and objectivity that, or help bolster objectivity, if that's ever a problem.
Well, I think the way in which I've dealt with this in my film is the same way in which I've dealt with it in my ethnographic research. And I think because in the film, the participants are speaking, on their own, oftentimes you're sort of held more accountable to make sure that you're not, there isn't kind of a form of bias. I think so oftentimes I work through these sort of issues of objectivity and bias in my research before I even start filming. I have a very good sense of, I usually have a pretty good sense of what the, how these issues are going to play out, because I've already done the research, I've already written about it, and I think that's important. I also, I certainly, people do sign their releases, and one of the really important steps for me in making my films is also after the film is edited and the rough cut is done, I actually show my film to all the participants who are in the film, and they have an opportunity to sort of object to, if they are being misrepresented in a certain way, and I will take parts out of the film if they object to that, and I'm very clear to them about what is the intended topic and the venue for a specific film that I'm making, and I don't know if there is, if you can be completely objective, and I don't know if it is possible to be completely objective when you're working on a film. I approach my research, and as well as my films from kind of my own experience as well. But I think one of the commitment that I try to make is to let people tell their own experience or share their own story and not speak for them. And I think film actually provides a medium to be able to do that, where people are actually telling their own story as opposed to you, saying what they think. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think we have one more question, or time for one more question. I don't want to keep anybody too long, but along those lines, actually, two questions. If that's all right with you. So if you guys can just hold on for a little bit longer. First, kind of as a follow-up to that, I was wondering if you could talk more specifically about the IRB process and any unique ethical considerations or challenges that might come up because of the medium.
So the that's a great question, and the IRB process is so the films that I've worked on so far have come out of my dissertation, and that's the research that I've already done for my dissertation. So when I actually did the IRB before I even started doing my dissertation research, and I actually think that that is a valuable process for people to go through for their research. And when I'm making films, that the information that I'm collecting, data that I'm collecting, I also I'm collecting with the awareness that I might use a lot of the material that doesn't make it into the film into a supplementary reading about the film, or a supplementary reading about the topic that is being explored within the film. So I actually go through, when I'm doing research, or I've done research in the past, I went through the IRB process as a form of traditional research before I picked up the camera. And for the purpose of making film, you know, I usually have people sign release forms that are very similar to the releases that are signed, you know, after you finish doing research. When you're doing research, interviews for sort of text, other research, and I think for me, between that and the research that I do, or the IRB process that I went through before I started doing research, for me, it addresses some of these concerns. And of course, all of these concerns cannot be fully addressed, and there are some challenges that emerge. But I do feel like I try my best to address them in my work.
Sure. No, thank you. All right. So the last question I think we can get to is if you had any suggestions for specific workshops or training for people that maybe hadn't had, I guess, how people get into ethnographic filming.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I learned filmmaking, first as a documentary filmmaker and then as an ethnographic filmmaker, and I've been trained in my undergraduate as well as graduate studies. But I think taking courses on how to, first of all, make documentary film might be a good place to start, and also collaborating with documentary filmmakers. To, one of the things that's, you have to keep in mind about film is that you don't have to do it. You cannot do it alone. In fact, it's a very collaborative process. It's not a process that you can actually do on your own. Unlike writing in ethnography, it requires that you work with other people on different capacities. So a great entry into to filmmaking, if people have not necessarily tried something out yet, is to collaborate with someone who has a little bit of experience in making films. And what you can offer, and that's actually what I do when I'm teaching ethnographic film. I try to pair up students who have background in ethnographic research and ethnographic methods with students who have background in film and media studies. And you can sort of recognize that there are sort of strengths that two people can bring together, and what anthropologists can offer is the kind of research. I think there's a question that is being asked: is ethnographic film necessarily a documentary, or do you think there's a distinction between ethnographic film and documentary? And I think those boundaries are very fluid, but I do believe that ethnographic film, follows a long-term research and an awareness of a particular topic or a particular community that we're representing in a way that maybe documentary does not necessarily. A lot of documentary filmmakers have a very similar approach to, doing journalism, where you go in, get the story, and leave. And I think ethnographic film, for me at least, I spent a lot of time trying to understand a particular topic or a particular community before I even pick up my camera and start shooting a film.
Excellent. Well, I think that's all we have time for. But thank you very much for coming. And,
yeah, thank you. I apologize I wasn't able to get through my entire presentation.
No, yeah, no, it'll be available online. And actually, if you have any further questions, you can send them to conferences@aaanet.org, and those I'll send them off to Harjant. And yeah, so this is the last webinar that we will be having until August, but there will be information on I guess topics that we'll be looking at in the following year. We'll probably have some kind of a polling that the viewers, will get to interact with and choose what we look at, because obviously we don't want you guys to be listening to boring things. And yeah, thank you very much.
The one thing I'll just quickly say is that all my documentaries that I've made so far, and are actually online. So if you'd like to see them in entirety, you can just find them on Vimeo or YouTube. And also, I've put a link here to videos that my students made in their ethnographic film class. So please feel free to check them out. They're also they're wonderful little 10-minute ultra shorts that my students made over the course of the semester, following the sort of approach that I take to ethnographic film, and hopefully that will be useful maybe in your research or in your teaching.
Excellent. All right. Well, that concludes today's webinar. Have a good summer, everybody.
Thank you so much.